Hey, welcome back to the Mind of Brandon. Today we're going to continue our Bible study. As indicated by the title of this video, I'm going to be talking about flood myths. Now you guys probably already know about the biblical flood story of Noah's Ark, but before that story was ever written, there were already several different ancient cultures producing their own stories about some man being advised by some god that he should build a boat to survive a flood that's going to be sent to destroy the rest of humanity. Turns out that flood myths go all the way back to the earliest written language known to us. I refer, of course, to the Sumerian language. In Sumerian tradition, the flood hero is a king from the city of Shuruppak called Ziusudra. He's a pious, God-fearing, religious devotee who performs the proper sacrifices to the gods. And so it makes sense that when there's a disagreement among the gods, some of them bitter about this decision to wipe out all of humanity, one of them goes to Ziusudra and advises him to build a boat. So the flood rages for 7 days and 7 nights, and then the sun god comes out to dry the land. Then Ziusudra offers sacrifices of sheep and oxen to the gods. That's when they bestow him with immortality. So that's the gist of the Sumerian version of the story. That said, there is evidence in the soil for massive flooding in the land of Sumer around the time that King Ziusudra is believed to have reigned. So this story does appear that it may be based on an actual flood. It's just that the flood didn't actually cover the entire world. Although, some people would point out that there are flood myths from basically all over the world, right? Not only are there other flood myths from the Middle East, there's also some from Hindu tradition, Greco-Roman tradition, ancient Egypt, ancient China, even the Aztecs from ancient Mexico have their own flood myth. And some people, this is not exactly a widely held scholarly opinion, but there's some random Joe Schmoes out there who have the attitude that the existence of these different flood myths from all over the world are evidence that there really was a worldwide flood. Personally, I think it's more likely that there was a flood that happened at a particular time and place that the Sumerians are talking about, and a different flood happening at a different time at a different place that the Aztecs are talking about. Let's face it, floods happen every now and then, here, there, at different times, right? Makes sense that different ancient cultures are going to be exposed to them and tell their own stories about them. That's why the story told by the Aztecs is so different from the story told by that of the Sumerians. But some flood myths are actually pretty similar, especially in the Middle East. Eventually, the land of the Sumerians would come to be taken over by a Shemitic-speaking people known as the Babylonians. And the Babylonians took not only the land of Sumer, but they took their culture as well, appropriating their mythology. And so there is a Babylonian version of the flood story where the flood hero is called Atrahasis. That said, later in history, another Shemitic-speaking people, known as the Assyrians, would take the lands previously conquered by the Babylonians, and it's from an Assyrian library that we have our best surviving version of an epic poem known as the Epic of Gilgamesh. Now, source material for the Epic of Gilgamesh actually goes back to the Babylonians and the Sumerians, but our best surviving version comes from an Assyrian library. And so, what this story does is it appropriates the story of Atrahasis, but in our best surviving version, his name is actually Utnapishtim. Okay? So the story of Utnapishtim appears as a story within a larger story in the Epic of Gilgamesh. Gilgamesh, by the way, that's another Sumerian king. He's not a flood hero, but he gets to meet the flood hero Utnapishtim. Gilgamesh, actually his Sumerian name was Bilgamesh with a B instead of a G. Gilgamesh with a G is the Shemitic adaptation of his name. I did talk about him a little bit in a previous video. He is the one that went into the Garden of Inanna and slew the serpent that had made a nest in the roots of the Halupu tree. So he's a very renowned and legendary folk hero. That said, Gilgamesh is perceived to have been descended from the gods. Or in other words, he's part god is the idea. And that's a common conception in antiquity, the idea that kings are either divine or semi-divine beings, right? And so just as the gods are typically depicted as larger than everyone else, same goes for the kings. And Gilgamesh is no exception. He's a very big man. He's essentially a giant. Now, I don't want you guys to get the false impression thinking that, because Gilgamesh is semi-divine and he's a legendary folk hero, that means he's somehow morally perfect and pure. No. He does have character flaws. He's a very wild and woolly king. He actually has advisors who lecture him on how to properly rule, right? He actually abuses his royal authority. One of the things that he does is he uses his power as king to have sex with a bunch of different women. Actually, whenever there's a couple in the land that's getting married, he gets first dibs at the bride. Yeah, he gets to flower the bride before she marries. As you can imagine, people are not too happy about that. But nonetheless, he is a legendary folk hero. So in his adventures, Gilgamesh becomes interested in figuring out how to achieve immortality. So he seeks out the immortal flood hero, Utnapishtim. Utnapishtim explains to Gilgamesh that there was a disagreement among the gods, some of them bitter about this decision to wipe out all of humanity. And so the god Ea went to Utnapishtim and advised him to build a boat. So Utnapishtim took some family aboard, he took some animals aboard, he even took some craftsmen along since they might come in handy with the rebuilding of society. And together they survived on this boat during the worldwide flood while the rest of humanity was destroyed. As the floodwaters began to recede, the boat came to rest on a mountain, and Utnapishtim released then a couple of different birds, a dove and a raven, just to see whether or not they'd come back. The idea is that if the bird comes back, it didn't find any dry land, it's still covered in floodwaters. But if the bird doesn't come back, then the flood's over. So the first bird that he sends out does come back, meaning that, land's still covered in floodwaters. But then later when he sends out the other bird, it does not come back. The flood is over. So Utnapishtim leaves his boat and he performs animal sacrifices to the gods, and they bestow him with immortality. That said, in Hindu tradition, we're going to see another flood myth. In a previous video, I talked a little bit about a god called Brahma. He gives birth to the first goddess from his side. Right? Well, the name of that goddess was Sarasvati, and she gives birth to a man called Manu. Now, Manu is the Hindu flood hero. Okay? And in this story, it's actually quite different, at least at the start. Manu comes across this tiny fish. It's a talking fish. This is one of those stories with a talking animal. Right? Remember the talking snake in the Garden of Eden? Okay, sorry. So, it's a talking fish, and it's worried about getting eaten by bigger fish. So it asks Manu to rescue it. So Manu ends up raising this fish, and as he's raising it, it keeps getting bigger. It's growing up, it's becoming a big fish itself, right? It starts outgrowing the different environments that Manu's keeping. He has to keep moving, he has to keep relocating this fish. And so finally the fish gets so big, he just puts it in the sea. And then that's when the fish reveals that it is in fact the god Vishnu. So the god Vishnu has come to Manu in the form of a fish. Guess we might as well call him Vishnu, right? Okay, alright, so anyway, Vishnu in the form of a fish. He tells Manu that he's going to save him from the next flood. But he's got some instructions that Manu is going to have to follow. So Manu builds a boat. He takes some other people aboard this boat. Together they survive on the boat during the flood while Vishnu in his fish form is sort of towing him around, right? But anyway, Manu sees this tree sticking up out of the waters. He gets this idea of, I'm going to go, tie this boat up to the tree. The tree's basically, it's at the top of a mountain, so he's thinking he's going to land on the mountain, right? And Vishnu says, I don't think that's such a good idea. You land on that mountain, and the boat's going to end up kind of dangling from the mountain, right? So it's like it's kind of poking fun of the story of Utnapishtim, landing his boat on the mountain, right? And so that's why I think it's interesting to bring this story up, because at first it seems like really different from the other flood myths, but then this comes along, right? It really does look like it is influenced by the Middle Eastern flood tradition. The author is taking some liberties, using some of his own creativity, having some fun with it, but it really does appear to have been influenced by that Middle Eastern flood tradition. Manu does go on to worship Vishnu and provide offerings for him. That said, there's all sorts of other flood myths that I'd like to talk about, but I think we're going to conclude with the biblical flood story of Noah's Ark. So that story begins, I would say, at the start of Genesis chapter 6. Although technically we're introduced to the character of Noah at the end of Genesis chapter 5, which is a really boring chapter. It's just a bunch of begetment from the bloodlines of Adam and Eve, the first man and the first woman. They beget so-and-so, who beget so-and-so, who beget so-and-so, blah, 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 until you have the birth of Noah and his sons Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Noah's son Shem, by the way, that is where we get the word Shemite, as in the Shemitic family of languages, that family of languages where we find Canaanite and Hebrew and Babylonian and Assyrian, among others. But anyway, Genesis chapter 6 tells us that it came to pass that when men began to multiply on the face of the earth, and daughters were born unto them, that the sons of God saw the daughters of men, that they were beautiful, and they took them as wives, as many as they wanted. Now, pay attention to this part about the sons of God. Remember what I told you earlier. It's common in antiquity for kings to be considered either divine or semi-divine beings. Sometimes they're even perceived as the son of this god or that god, right? There's a Sumerian king called Meski-Agesher who's described as the son of Utu. That's the Sumerian sun god. The idea that the king is son of the sun god, that's actually a common tradition over in ancient Egypt. The king is often identified as Sa-Re, son of the sun god Re, right? But anyway, so these sons of God in the Bible, they're taking all these women as their wives. They're having sex with a bunch of different women, right? Just like Gilgamesh, right? And it does tell us that giants existed in the earth in those days, right? Remember what I said about how gods and kings are commonly depicted as larger than everyone else, right? They're very big men, right? They're essentially giants. Right? And it tells us that when these sons of God impregnated the daughters of men, that the same became mighty men, the heroes of old and men of renown. So yeah, it does appear it's talking about these various ancient legendary folk heroes, figures like Gilgamesh, right? And I would say that the author of this Noah's Ark story actually seems to be chastising pagan men for their veneration of characters like Gilgamesh. Like I said, he's not exactly a pure soul. You know who is a pure soul, though? The flood hero, right? Remember, he's a pious, God-fearing, religious devotee who performs the proper sacrifices for the gods. And in this particular story in the Bible, it's Noah. It tells us Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord. And so God advises Noah to build a boat, gives him instructions, here's how you do it, right? And so Noah builds this boat. He takes some family aboard. He takes some animals aboard. Together they survive on the boat during the worldwide flood while the rest of humanity is destroyed. And so as the floodwaters begin to recede, the boat lands on Mount Ararat, which is located just north of Assyria, where we found our best surviving version of the Epic of Gilgamesh. And just as Utnapishtim had released a dove and a raven to see whether or not they would come back, Noah also is going to release a dove and a raven to see whether or not they're going to come back. And so when he realizes that the flood is over, he leaves the boat and he performs an animal sacrifice for God. And then God vows to never wipe out humanity with a flood again. Now, notice how similar this story of Noah's Ark is to the story of Utnapishtim, as well as the other flood myths we already talked about. It's pretty abundantly evident that this biblical flood story was influenced by the earlier Middle Eastern flood tradition. And so the flood story has been handed down to biblical tradition from pagan tradition. It's part of that same flood tradition going back to the flood myth told by the Sumerians. That flood myth that was appropriated during the Shemitic invasions of the land. Invasions by the cultures of the Assyrians and the Babylonians. That said, I will be talking more about these Shemitic invasions in future videos. So, to be continued. I hope you all enjoyed this video. If you did, please give it a thumbs up. Maybe even share it with other people. If you're interested in watching my future videos, please subscribe to this channel if you haven't already. In my next video, I'm going to be returning to the subject of the Babylonians to discuss the Tower of Babel. So I hope to see you all there. Thank you for watching. Peace, and have a good one.